My employer replaced me with a young woman, thinking I was no longer suitable. But a year later, I became the owner of his company, and the first thing I did was fire him. I made him unemployed for life. Stay with us until the very end to find out how the story ends. We look forward to your comments and thoughts on the story. That day, I arrived at work as usual, 20 minutes before the start of my shift. I enjoyed watching the office wake up, the computers turning on, the first good morning echoing in the hallway, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen. I had worked at this company for almost 19 years. I celebrated my 40th birthday here, got divorced here, and rebuilt my life here after my children left for college. The office became part of my world, part of me. My position wasn't the highest, but it wasn't the lowest either. I knew everything, from client files to the smallest details in accounting. My memory replaced many people's diaries. My voice was the one that calmed everyone down when things went wrong. I didn't just work. I kept everything in delicate balance, as only a woman who has been through a lot but has lost neither her kindness nor her fortitude can do. And then he called me into his office. My boss, Josh, young, ambitious, with that smile that shows no respect, only self-importance. He sat down across from me and delivered his speech with almost enthusiasm, as if announcing something wonderful. We've been looking at the structure. We've decided to move forward, to be more dynamic, more flexible. You've done a great job, Carol, but we want to try a new direction. We've hired someone who can bring some fresh energy. I listened and didn't understand right away. He didn't say, "You're fired." He said, "I no longer fit in," that I had become unsuitable, outdated. He said it gently, but his words said it all. I no longer belonged there. I had been replaced. A young woman, with a great resume, with a perfect social media profile, with long eyelashes and short patience. I walked out onto the street with a box in my hands. I couldn't even hold back the tears, not from hurt, but from emptiness. They didn't just close the door on me, they told me that no one needed me anymore. I stood at the bus stop until it got dark. People walked by, and I sat there and thought, is that it? Is that how my story ends? I didn't know yet that it wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I didn't sleep for almost 2 days. At first, I just stared at the ceiling, unable to accept reality. My desk, my folders, my favorite mugs. Everything was left there, in the office, in the past. All I had left was silence. In the evening, I took out an old album. Photos from company parties, diplomas, thank you letters. I had been part of this business for so many years. I had put my whole heart into it. And then they simply showed me the door, politely, with a smile, but firmly. On my first day after being fired, I tried to distract myself. I tidied up the house, washed the windows, and repotted the flowers. It seemed that if I put everything around me in order, it would be easier inside. It wasn't. On the second day, I opened my laptop, without any particular purpose, just to open it. And there, sitting in front of a blank screen, I suddenly realized all the information, all the structure, dozens of clients. It was all in my head. I know how this company works. I know its strengths and weaknesses. I know its suppliers, clients, and partners. I'm not just an employee. I'm a repository of living experience. I started writing, first rough drafts, then a structure. I wrote down how to improve customer service, where to cut costs, how to automate tasks that took hours to do manually. I didn't know why I was doing it. I just wrote, because I couldn't stop. A week passed, then 2. I put everything into a document, and suddenly I thought, what if I try? Not to get revenge, not to prove anything, just to build something of my own, something small, something free, based on experience, humanity, and respect. And then, for the first time in a long time, I smiled at myself. I applied for a grant for women entrepreneurs. I signed up for a webinar. Then I signed up for a marketing course. I didn't know how it worked, but I knew the most important thing: what customers want. Because for 20 years, I had answered their calls, listened to their complaints, and solved their problems. Every day, it was as if I was growing wings. I woke up before my alarm clock. I had breakfast with a notebook in my hands. I studied, planned, and called former clients of the company. I talked to those who were satisfied, who missed my voice. Some asked, "Are you working at that company again?" And I replied modestly, "No, I'm starting my own." I wasn't building empires. I just wanted to be treated with respect. I didn't want anyone to write off a woman who had worked conscientiously her entire life. And then a letter arrived. It was from one of the key partners the company had worked with for almost 10 years. He wrote, "If you are really starting your own business, we are open to discussing cooperation." I read the letter 5 times. Tears rolled down my cheeks, and I realized this was the beginning, the real beginning. I printed out that letter and hung it above my desk, which was then in the corner of the living room, an ordinary kitchen table covered with papers, folders, and cups of half-drunk coffee. The letter became more than just an offer to me. It was confirmation. I was remembered, trusted, and respected. It meant that I had done everything right. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time, preparing for the first real call. My heart was pounding as if I were that girl again, 20 years ago, being offered her first job. I called, and the voice on the other end was warm, confident, sincere. We talked for almost 2 hours. They were really ready to work with me. What's more, they were happy that I was finally starting my own thing. I didn't expect everything to happen so quickly. A week later, I signed my first independent contract. The next day, I signed my second. I rented a tiny office in a business center on the outskirts of town. It had no furniture, peeling walls, and smelled like paint. But for me, it was mine. My first office. I brought my old mug there, bought a small desk, and sat down to work with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in decades. In the evenings, I came home with aching hands and burning eyes. I fell asleep with plans for tomorrow and woke up with new ideas. Sometimes, when I passed by the mirror, I didn't recognize myself. This woman had regained her life, her confidence, her proud posture. And there was no more pain in her eyes. My former colleagues started contacting me. Some called out of curiosity, some to congratulate me, and some to ask if I had a place for them. I didn't hold a grudge. I understood that they just wanted to survive. But now I was the one making the rules. One evening, as I was typing up another report, my phone lit up. The name on the screen was Tom, my former boss, the one who told me to my face that my time was up. I didn't answer. I just turned my phone face down, and for the first time, I felt that I wasn't angry. I was above that. I had my own path. But that night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. His words came back to me, his smile as he handed me the envelope with my dismissal letter. And at some point, I realized that I wasn't done yet. I'm not just building my own business. I'm building a future where people like me won't be written off anymore, where experience will be more important than age, where respect is the norm, not a reward. I wasn't just moving forward, I was coming back, stronger than ever. 3 months have passed since I signed my first contract. My modest office is no longer empty. Now there is a real desk, a comfortable chair, and a whiteboard on the wall with plans for the coming weeks. Under the window is a potted palm tree, which seems like a symbol of something new and growing. Every time I walked into the room, I felt a slight thrill of excitement. This was my territory, my work, my freedom. Clients started coming in, not from the street. They came on recommendation. First 1, then 2, then 10. I never rushed around. I welcomed them with a cup of coffee, a smile, and my full attention. I didn't need to play boss. I just listened, understood, and made decisions. People felt it, and they stayed. I wasn't chasing scale. I wanted reliability. I didn't need an office in the city center or an army of employees, but I did need one person, an assistant, someone who could take on some of the tasks and whom I could trust. I placed an ad, and a week later, a young woman came in. She was confident, with a serious look on her face. Her name was Carol. She reminded me of myself at that age, knocking on doors with a folder under my arm. Carol and I hit it off right away. I showed her everything I had learned in my career, and she brought in modern approaches that I sometimes lacked. We became the perfect team. She would say, "You have no idea how great it is to work with you." And I thought to myself, yes, because no one humiliates you or thinks you're outdated. One day, Carol brought in a report and asked, "Did you really used to work at that company where everyone is running around like headless chickens? I hear it's a complete mess." I smiled. Yes, for many years, until they decided I wasn't right for the job anymore. She thought for a moment and said quietly, "They shouldn't have done that. Now you're the one moving up, not them." I kept my cool, but something lit up inside me. Yes, I was moving up. And more people were noticing. Another month passed. My company began to generate a steady income. I regained not only my respect and confidence, but also the money I had once saved. I opened a second account where I put every dollar I earned. An idea was forming in my head, not just to survive, but to stand firm and stay there for a long time. And then I made up my mind. I contacted a business acquisition agency. I was only interested in one thing, my former company. It was up for partial sale. Its financial indicators were falling. Key clients were leaving. They had made a mistake when they let me go, and now they were on the brink. I didn't say a word to Carol. I just submitted the paperwork. I just made the down payment. I just watched as the story unfolded. I remember the day I received the letter. "Your application to acquire a controlling stake has been approved. All that remains is the final meeting." I wasn't shaking or feverish. I had only one feeling: quiet determination. I put on my gray suit, pulled my hair back, and put all the necessary documents in a folder. I didn't go to that meeting as an avenger. I went as a person who was going after what was hers. The office I arrived at was in the same building where I used to work. Everything seemed familiar: the stairs, the tiles, even the sound of the water cooler in the hallway. But I didn't turn left toward my old department. I went up one floor to the conference room where the important people usually sat. Now they were waiting for me there. When I entered, Tom was already sitting at the table. He had aged. His face was tense, his eyes darting around. I noticed him flinch when he saw me. "Emily?" he breathed. I nodded without sitting down. "Hello, Tom. You know why I'm here." He tried to smile as he used to, condescendingly, but he couldn't. The woman sitting in front of him was not the woman who could be fired with a single signature. The woman sitting in front of him was the woman who had come to sign his death warrant. The documents were drawn up quickly. Everything had already been decided. The lawyers just confirmed that most of the company now belonged to me. I could do whatever I wanted, from strategy to staffing. When we left the room, Tom approached me in the hallway. "You're not going to fire me, are you?" His voice trembled. I looked at him calmly. "No, Tom. I'm going to fire you nicely, with gratitude for your contribution, so that you can tell everyone how you left on your own terms." He stood there silently, and I walked past him just as he had once walked past my desk without saying goodbye. The next day, I walked into my new company's office for the first time as the owner. The employees looked up, surprised, hopeful, skeptical. I knew many of them by name: secretaries, accountants, interns. They didn't need any explanation. They understood everything when I smiled and said, "Good morning. Let's start with some changes." On my first day, I didn't hold any formal meetings. Instead, I went from office to office, not as the new boss, but as someone who wanted to understand what was really going on there. People looked confused, as if they couldn't believe that I was now the center of their world. Some looked away, some smiled with relief, and some just froze in their chairs, not knowing how to behave. I knew very well that many of them remembered the day I was shown the door. I didn't blame them. Back then, I felt like a nobody too. I went into the department where I used to work every day. My old desk was now empty. No one dared to take it. I ran my hand over the surface as if saying goodbye to the past, and then I sat down. Just sat down in the chair I had once stood up from after being told I was no longer needed. And you know what I felt? Confidence. A strange feeling that I had returned not for revenge, but for order, for justice. Among the employees, I quickly found those who had kept the department afloat when management didn't notice their efforts. I remembered how an accountant named Nancy once stayed late to sort out the financial reports, and no one even thanked her. Now I approached her personally. "I want you to head the department," I said bluntly. She was taken aback. "Me? But I have no administrative experience. Did your former boss have any?" I smiled. She laughed for the first time in years, sincerely, with relief, as if she had finally been allowed to be herself. Such changes were happening everywhere. People were lifting their heads, coming back to themselves. The company was waking up from a long, deep sleep. Tom remained in the building at that time. He was like a ghost, walking around pretending to be needed, visiting employees he didn't even know by name. He was waiting for me to leave him, to forget him. But I delayed my decision not because I had doubts, but because I was preparing his last work meeting. When everything was ready, I gathered the team in the same conference room where we had once been evaluated based on deadlines, tables, and age. I walked out to them with my laptop and said, "Today we're not going to discuss reports. Today I want to tell you why I'm here, why I came back, and who is now in charge of this story." And I told them. Everything. Without anger, without accusations, without bitterness, just the facts. My path, their paths. How one person decided that I was outdated and how I turned his company into a new story. When I finished, everyone was silent, but their eyes were burning, for the first time in many years, everyone's eyes. And then I announced that Tom would not be coming to work tomorrow. He never showed up to say goodbye. The first few weeks in my new position were like a storm, noisy, turbulent, but at the same time incredibly inspiring. I entered the office not as someone who had once been humiliated, but as a woman who had stood her ground and returned with her head held high. The first thing I did was fire the people who had essentially helped Mark push me out. And you know, I did it without shouting and without a vengeful fire in my eyes. I just opened the folders with reports, figures, and failures, and everything fell into place. Cold, rational, clear. I didn't want revenge. I wanted a clean slate. I wanted everyone on every floor, from the reception area to the boardroom, to know that things would be different now. The hardest part was building trust. People were afraid that I had come to make drastic changes, but I wanted to give a chance to those who really wanted to work. I started with the basics. I talked to each department personally, listened to suggestions, and looked into complaints. The company was stuck in that old toxic corporate culture, rude bosses, tired employees, zero motivation, and having gone through it all myself, I knew exactly what needed to change. I brought in internal mentors, restructured the HR department, and introduced support for women over 40 because it was important to me that no one else felt useless because of their age. And you know, the most touching moments came when women with gray hair at their temples, with sincere eyes and trembling hands, came up to me and said, "Thank you. We thought no one needed us anymore." I hugged them and remembered myself. The one Mark fired with a cold stare and the words, "You're not right for this job anymore." Now there was laughter in that building. People started staying after their shifts to finish projects, not because they were afraid, but because they wanted to. And to be honest, I felt alive for the first time in many years, not just as a boss, but as someone who could make a difference. But the most unexpected turn of events was yet to come. I sat in my office by the large window and looked at the city that greeted me every morning without the pain I used to feel. I was no longer afraid to go to work. I didn't feel like a spare part anymore. But then one day he showed up at the reception desk. Mark. Yes, the very same man who had once thrown me out of the company like a useless suitcase. He stood at the counter, his spine straight, wearing the same mask of cold composure, but his gaze was different, extinguished, exhausted. He asked the secretary to connect him to me, and I told him to come in. He entered the office and froze for a moment. Everything was different. His power was no longer palpable. The furniture had been replaced, the photos of employees on the wall, the glass partitions, the open lighting. Everything said, "This is a different place." He sank into the chair opposite me like a stranger, as if he had been called to see a doctor. He no longer carried himself with confidence, and the first thing he said was not hello or congratulations, but "I didn't expect you to make it." He said it quietly, with a hoarse voice, and looked away, as if he was ashamed of his words. I looked at him and said nothing. Surprisingly, I felt no anger inside. I felt tired from the memories, but I didn't feel any desire for revenge. Mark began to talk. He told me that he had been fired from another company, that he had connections with investors, but the project didn't take off, that the young assistant he had once fired me for had left him for someone else and later leaked his ideas to competitors, that he was left with nothing. He said he hadn't come to ask for a job, just to talk. He admitted that he had made a big mistake, that he had underestimated not only me, but also the value of a person who knows their business not from presentations, but from experience. I looked at him, and sitting in front of me was not the powerful man who had once handed me my dismissal papers with a smirk. Sitting in front of me was a man who had lost everything. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. "Not for a second chance, just because you deserve it." My hands were clasped on my knees. I nodded. I didn't say, "I forgive you." I didn't say, "You were right," or "I was stronger." I just said, "I'm glad you understand." He left, and I sat there by the window and felt complete for the first time in a long time. Not because someone had fallen, but because I had stood up. After meeting Mark, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Everything was spinning in my head. His voice, his haggard face, his eyes that no longer held any arrogance. I remembered myself on the day he said, "You're outdated. We want a fresh perspective." At the time, those words hit me like a whip, but now they were a thing of the past that I had survived and conquered. I woke up at dawn and went out onto the balcony with a cup of strong coffee, watching the first rays of sun cling to the glass towers of the city. I no longer lived in a cramped apartment with cheap furniture. I had rebuilt my life slowly, brick by brick. I hadn't just taken over the company, I had transformed myself. And that was my greatest achievement. But life continued to throw surprises my way. The following week, I received an invitation to speak at a conference for women leaders. There were more than 300 women in the room, all very different. Some were just starting their own businesses, some had gone through divorce, and some, like me, were starting from scratch after betrayal and loss. I was given 20 minutes on stage, but when I went out there, time disappeared. I just talked without notes, without drama, about how I lost my job, how I spent my nights writing projects, how I fought my inner fears and external pressures, how I refused to let my age become a sentence. And when I said, I wasn't younger, I was more experienced. And that's what made me stronger. The audience stood up. The women applauded standing up. And I had tears in my eyes. I realized that people were listening to my story, that it wasn't just important to me. After the conference, people came up to me, hugged me, and shared their stories. Some said, "You gave me hope." Others said, "I thought it was too late for me to change." And one woman in her 60s with silver hair and a steady gaze, simply took me by the hand and said, "Thank you. Now I know that we have a tomorrow, too." I walked home in complete silence, but inside I felt warm. It had all been worth it. Every sleepless night, every humiliation, every step in the dark. It had all led me here, to a moment where I could inspire others. And that night, I made a decision that changed my life forever. When I woke up the next morning, everything inside me was calm. Not because there were no problems, there were plenty of them, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was on my own path. Not someone else's, not one that had been imposed on me, my own. And ahead of me was not emptiness, but light. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and hovered the cursor over a folder called Mentora Program. It was my idea, something I had dreamed of even when I was sitting in that old office with faded walls, listening to Mark say that it's difficult to adapt to the market at a mature age. I nodded silently, but inside I already knew. One day I would start my own platform for women who had been written off, just like I had been. Now I could do it. I created a support fund. I found a team of women like me with different backgrounds but with one goal: to prove that age is not a sentence but an advantage. We started developing the project. We sat up late at night, made presentations, and discussed how to help women not only survive but rise up, beautifully, proudly, and intelligently. One day was particularly memorable. A woman named Helen came in for a consultation. She was 59 and had worked as an accountant at a school her entire life. And then one day, reforms, layoffs, no one even explained anything. She stood at the door of my office and said quietly, "I'm sorry, I don't even have a resume. I've worked in the same place my whole life." I sat her down and we talked for an hour and a half. Then some more. Then she came back again. 3 months later, she started her own business, an accounting agency for retired teachers. She came to me in a new suit, standing up straight, and said, "Thank you. You taught me not to be afraid of being needed again." And I realized, I'm not creating a company. I'm creating a community. I'm creating change. And then something unexpected happened. I received a letter from Mark. Unofficial. Short. No complaints. No demands. Just, "I see what you've done, and now I understand what I've lost. If you're ever ready, I'd like to talk. No strings attached. Just to apologize." I read it 10 times, not to reply, but to realize how far I had come. I no longer waited, proved myself, or needed recognition. Everything I needed was already with me. I clicked archive, without anger, without a desire for revenge, just with a sense of closure. That evening, sitting in the office where his desk used to be, I looked out at the city and thought about how life changes. Slowly, sometimes cruelly, but if you hold on, it lifts you higher than you ever dreamed. Every morning began the same way: a cup of strong coffee, a few minutes of silence by the window, and a deep breath. Only now it wasn't an escape from reality, but gratitude for the new one I had built with my own hands. My company, my team, my story. But with growing influence came new challenges. One day, I received an invitation to a business conference, the biggest event of the year in our field. And not just as a guest, I was invited to speak. My name was on the list next to people I once knew only from articles in business magazines. I had my doubts, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want ostentatious recognition. Quiet success was enough for me, but my team insisted, "You inspired us. You must inspire others." I walked onto the stage in a simple, light-colored suit. There were more than 800 people in the room, but I didn't feel afraid, just a strange sense of calm, as if I had finally come home. "My name is Sandra," I began, "and I'm not here because it was easy. I'm here because when things got tough, I didn't give up." I told my story, without embellishment, about betrayal, humiliation, fear, about how I ended up broke, and how I picked myself up, step by step, not to prove anything to anyone, but to feel like myself again. When I finished, the audience stood up. People applauded standing up. But the most important thing was that women came up to me afterwards, young, middle-aged, elderly. Some were in tears, some had trembling hands. One said, "I worked for 30 years and was fired. Today, for the first time in a year, I felt like I had a future." It wasn't just recognition, it was confirmation. Everything I had been through had meaning. Later, in the hallway of the conference room, I saw a familiar silhouette. Mark. He had aged. His posture seemed bent. He stood aside, hesitating to approach, but his eyes, they held a pain that was impossible to fake. I approached him first. "Sandra," he said, "I don't even know where to start." "Don't," I smiled calmly. "It's already started. Without you." He lowered his gaze, and I raised my head, because at that moment, I finally understood. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the strength to move forward without looking back. Later, when I got home, I took off my shoes, walked barefoot through the kitchen, and thought that I had probably never been so happy. Not because I had gotten revenge, but because I was free. A week had passed since the conference, but the feeling of inner elation had not left me for a minute. I looked at my team, now almost 20 people, most of whom, like me, had once been left without a job, without support, without faith in themselves. Together, we weren't just creating a company, we were building an entire ecosystem for women whom society had told, "Your time is up." Our response was different. "Our time is just beginning." During those days, a woman named Daisy came to see me. She was 63, and with a trembling voice, she told me how she had been forced to leave her job at a supermarket. The young manager had decided that her age was slowing her down. "I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how to do anything else. Everything I knew how to do, no one needs anymore." I looked at her hands, worn and weathered from years of hard work, and I felt my heart sink. Because I had once sat there just like her. I placed my hand on hers and said quietly, "You have the most important thing, experience. We'll teach you everything else." And we did. 2 months later, Daisy was teaching beginner classes in our program, and 3 months after that, she opened her own online store selling eco-friendly products. When she came to me for her final meeting, her eyes were shining and her shoulders were straight. I thought my life was over, but it turned out it had just begun, and you were the first person who believed in me. And there were more and more stories like this. I felt my project growing beyond a simple idea. It was becoming a real movement. We started collaborating with foundations, universities, and large companies. We were given grants and invited to appear on television. I was no longer just a woman who had been fired. I had become a woman who had created an alternative. One evening, I came home late. I sat down in an armchair, wrapped myself in a blanket, and poured a glass of wine. An old photograph hung on the kitchen wall. Me, Mark, and our youth. I didn't take it down. Not because I missed him, but because it was a reminder of where I came from, and where I had come. My phone vibrated. It was a message from Mark's former employee, the one who whispered to me as I left, "You don't deserve this." Now she worked for me. The letter contained one sentence: "Thank you for staying true to yourself when others gave up." I turned off my phone. The room was quiet. But inside, it was as if music was playing. The music of victory. No shouting, no revenge. Just the victory of a woman who had not been broken. By the beginning of autumn, everything was back to normal. The company was growing steadily. Projects were reaching international levels, and I began to speak at closed business forums. Not as a victim of dismissal, but as someone who had managed to turn humiliation into an opportunity. I was invited to consult for large corporations, ironically, mainly on issues related to the adaptation of older women. I enjoyed it. But something bigger was brewing inside me. I realized that Mark and his entourage were still clinging to the remnants of their power. Their company was floundering in an attempt to save face, but things were getting worse. Layoffs, overtime, management changes. People wrote that there was a toxic atmosphere and a complete lack of trust. Now I only saw his face in old press releases, where everything looked fake, smiling, confident, with his new young team pressed up against him. But then one day I received an unexpected letter. It was from Ashley, the girl who had taken my place. "Sandra, I'm sorry. I didn't know how things would turn out. Mark fired me 6 months later. He said I lacked experience and dedication. I was left without a job, and with a reputation I had ruined myself. If you have a place for me, I'll do anything to make it up to you." I stared at those lines for a long time. And although part of me wanted to dismiss her, I remembered myself on that first evening after I was fired. No one reached out to me then. I couldn't do that to her. I took her on, not out of revenge, but as a chance for her. Ashley arrived quiet, modest, ready to do any job. I put her on support projects at first. She responded to letters from women who had just come to us, and to my surprise, she did it sincerely. She wasn't pretending. She really felt sorry for what had happened. 2 months later, I promoted her, and 6 months later, I entrusted her with training new coordinators. All this time, I felt that there are truly valuable victories in life. Those where you not only restore yourself, but also give others the opportunity to change. In the evening, I drove to the neighborhood where Mark and I used to live, just out of curiosity. Our old house was still standing, but now it was up for sale. I got out of the car, walked up to the gate, and saw someone standing in the shade under a tree. It was him. He was bloated, unshaven, wearing a worn jacket. He looked at me as if he couldn't believe it was me. "Sandra," he croaked, you're all—" I didn't answer. I just looked at the house, then at him, and calmly said, "And you said I was no longer good enough." He looked away, and I walked to the car, without hatred, without malice, just with a feeling of complete, final closure. I hadn't felt such strength inside me in a long time. It seemed like the whole year had been a test, every day a struggle to prove to myself that I was still capable of changing something. But right now, sitting in a chair on a high floor of an office building that had once been out of my reach, I realized that I was no longer just a former employee. I was now the boss. It all started with a report that my new managing director brought me. We had been tracking the company's performance after the change in management, and the numbers spoke for themselves. Revenues were up, the team was motivated, customers were returning. Everything was going just as I had dreamed, even better. And yet, just a year ago, I was fired from this same company for not fitting in with the spirit of the times. I decided to hold a general meeting. Both old employees and those who had joined the company after I arrived gathered in the hall. In front of us was a stage and a screen on which slides began to appear. Revenue growth, new contracts, customer reviews. I stood in front of them and felt like I was their captain. People listened, and in their eyes there was no fear, as there had once been with our former boss, but respect and inspiration. After the meeting, Lauren, the young woman who had replaced me, approached me. She looked lost and a little embarrassed. I wanted to apologize," she said. "I didn't even understand what was happening at the time. I was just put in your place. I didn't know." I looked at her calmly. "Lauren, you're here because you want to work, not because someone needed to replace me. What matters is who you are now. And if you're ready to grow and be honest, you're in the right place." Her eyes welled up with tears. I could see the relief in them. And at that moment, I realized that this was true strength. Not to seek revenge, but to change the system so that no one else would ever have to feel the humiliation I had gone through. That evening, I sat at home with a cup of tea, looking at the city lights and thinking about him, the man who had once fired me, convinced that I was a relic of the past. He never called again, but I knew he had heard about me. Rumors travel fast. One of his old friends may have already told him about the meeting, the figures, the new strategy, and maybe, just maybe, at that moment, he was sitting alone, surrounded by memories that no one wants to hear. I smiled. It wasn't a vengeful smile, but a tired, calm one, because I knew that my time was just beginning. With each passing day, my plan became clearer, as if life itself was telling me what to do. I no longer woke up with pain in my chest. Now I woke up thinking, "You're closer than ever." My morning coffee no longer tasted bitter. It was tart and strong, just like me. My first steps as a co-founder of the company were cautious but precise. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. I knew that if I stumbled, he would slam the door in my face again, and this time for good. But I was no longer someone who could be easily dismissed without explanation. I sat in board meetings, studied every line of the balance sheets, memorized the names of employees, listened to their stories, things he never did. I gathered information like pieces of a mosaic and built my influence bit by bit. I didn't walk into the office demanding power. I grew into it, like roots into soil. And when the moment came, I was no longer a guest in the company, I was part of it. A year ago, he fired me without looking me in the eye. Now he came to the office before everyone else, as if he sensed that his position was shaky. He became tense, rude even to those he had always fawned over. His face was covered with stress rashes, his hands trembled as he signed documents. And I sat across from him at meetings, with the same calm look he had once said, "You are no longer needed." Only now, he was the one who was no longer needed. I saw his despair grow. He tried to whisper to his partners, offer deals, call people into his office whom he wouldn't even shake hands with yesterday. But it was too late. I didn't take his power away from him. I took away his confidence, the very thing that made him feel untouchable. Meanwhile, I continued to strengthen my position. I hired a team of lawyers to secure my share on paper. I invested money in a project that he considered a failure. A month later, it became profitable. And when everyone saw this, they started to listen to me. Not just tolerate me as a figurehead, but really listen. He came into my office for the first time, not on business, just like that. He stood in the doorway, watching me sign documents at the very desk where he used to sit. I didn't even look up. He was silent, and then quietly, almost in a whisper, he said, "I never thought you'd get this far." I smiled. "I didn't think I was capable of this either, but you taught me well." That wasn't the end. It was just a warm-up for what I planned to do next. I looked at him sitting at the meeting and couldn't help but remember the day he crossed me out of the company's life like an unnecessary line in a report. Back then, he seemed like an immovable rock that couldn't be budged. Now he was slumped over, confused, a stranger. It was as if I had been at the helm all along, and he was just a random passenger, lost in the labyrinth of his own vanity. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was just doing my job. But every step I took in that building echoed in his throat. He felt my presence in every folder, every decision, every budget approval. And I was no longer hiding. On the contrary, I became the most visible figure. I spoke openly at meetings, boldly proposed reforms, and met with new investors. My name was heard more and more often. His name was heard less and less. Partners stopped looking back at him. They were more interested in what I had to say. One day, I walked into the conference room where he was trying to give a presentation to clients. His voice was shaking, his eyes were darting around. I stood in the back, against the wall, and just watched. I used to be afraid of his judgmental gaze. Now he was afraid of my silence. The clients looked at me, not him. Their questions flew to me, as if I were the one really running the business. I didn't take the floor away from him. I just took away his confidence, one drop at a time. A week later, I signed the document that finally secured my majority on the board. He didn't hear about it from me. He found out when he couldn't influence the decision he himself had initiated. I saw him leave the meeting room, clutching his phone tightly in his hand, get into his car, and sit there for a long time. And in the evening, he came back to my office, this time with documents. He held them in his trembling hands. It was his desperate plan to buy back the shares, a last attempt to regain at least some of his influence. I slowly leafed through the papers. Every word on those pages screamed, "It's too late." "It won't help," I said without looking up. "You can't buy back what you rejected yourself." He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring out the window. For the first time, I saw not an enemy, but emptiness. He used to be a man who could destroy someone's career with a single word. Now he was a man whom no one heard, not even himself. The next day, he didn't come to work. A week later, he handed in his resignation, and no one stopped him. Even the cleaning lady, whom he had never even greeted, passed by indifferently. I was left alone in his former office. The furniture was the same. The view from the window was the same, but everything inside was different. I didn't feel victory. I felt peace. I knew that everything I had now was the result of pain, patience, and strength. And then a new chapter began. One in which I didn't just save myself. One in which I became who I was always meant to be. After he left, the building seemed quieter. Even the air had changed. It was no longer filled with the heavy dust of fear. Employees began to breathe more freely. Their smiles were no longer forced. People who used to hide in the corridors began to stop by my office, just to say thank you. I didn't expect them to say anything, but they did. Some said quietly, "Thank you for staying." Others said, "Finally, we've become a company where people want to work." And I knew it wasn't just gratitude. It was a sign that I was on the right track. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was healing. Myself. Them. Everything that he had destroyed over the years with his pride, I rebuilt step by step. I lifted up people whom he once considered dead weight. I listened to suggestions from junior employees. I built a structure where respect flowed from the top down, not the other way around. One day, a woman from the accounting department knocked on my door. It was the same woman he had humiliated in front of everyone for an unacceptable mistake. She brought me a report and asked in a trembling voice, "Can I suggest something?" I smiled. "Not just can you. You must." These little things were more important than big wins. I didn't just become the owner of a company, I became someone who was trusted. And that, I realized, is the highest form of power. But even in moments of triumph, I never forgot how this story began. How I collected money in a shoebox, how I counted pennies in the store, how I lived in my friend's spare bedroom when he kicked me out with only a suitcase and indifference in his eyes. I remembered every detail, and it was this memory that kept me from relaxing. A few months after he left, I received a letter at the reception desk. The handwriting was his, recognizable, angular, confident, once upon a time. Inside was a sheet of paper with just 2 sentences. "I understand everything. Forgive me, if you can. But if you can't, at least don't rejoice in my downfall so much." I looked at those lines and felt nothing. No anger, no resentment, not even pride, only calmness. He didn't write this to ask for forgiveness, but to remind me that he had broken down after all. And he asked me not to rejoice, and I wasn't happy, because my goal was never to hurt him. I wanted to prove that a woman who was considered useless was capable of building an empire, not out of revenge, just by living a better life. Later, I found out that he was living with a distant relative. Sometimes he slept in his car. The business he tried to start with his last money collapsed after 2 months. His former friends, investors, and colleagues turned their backs on him, not because I asked them to, but because he had abused their trust for too long and then lost it irrevocably. I wasn't happy. But I didn't feel sorry for him either. Every story has a reason. Every reason has a consequence. And my story wasn't over yet, it was just gaining momentum. When I entered the conference room, where I had previously not been allowed to stay for more than 5 minutes, all eyes turned to me. Before, they looked at me as if I were invisible, ordinary, like a piece of furniture. Now they looked at me as a force to be reckoned with. I was wearing a light gray suit, my hair was neatly styled, and my eyes were calm. Not revenge, confidence. Behind me was a path that none of these people would ever dare to take. I stepped onto the podium where he, Mark, had once stood. My former boss, the man who had told me to my face last year that the time for people like you is over. He had smirked, patted me on the shoulder, and never for a second thought I would return. But I did, not just as an employee. I came back as the one who now makes the decisions. "Good morning," I said calmly, and the room fell silent. "Starting today, the management structure will change. And no, this is not a threat, it's just a fact." Mark sat in the corner. His eyes darted around like someone who understood everything but too late. He was confused, disheveled, his shirt wrinkled. No one greeted him at the door, no one poured him coffee, no one fawned over him. He was nobody, just another employee. Yesterday, he tried to talk to me, trying to remember the years we spent together, our Friday jokes in the office. But I looked right through him, as if he were already gone. I took a deep breath. Not for him, for myself. I deserved this moment.
Over the past year, the company has reached a whole new level. We have not only maintained our position, we have grown. I believe in experience. I believe in the power of age, in wisdom, in courage. I know these aren't popular words in a world where trends and youth are everything, but now this is our philosophy, and if anyone doesn't like it, the door is right there where you all saw me off. I paused. No one moved. "Mark," I finally addressed him. "You're fired, effective immediately. The reasons are clear to you. This is not an insult. It is the honesty you valued so much when you told me it was time for me to retire. Only now, you are the one listening." He did not respond. He just lowered his head. I left the room with the calmness I had dreamed of for the past year. No shouting, no revenge. I was above all that. And yet, I was justice. When I first stepped into my new office, it felt like I was in a dream. Everything was unusually quiet, even too quiet. The office where he used to sit, my former boss, the very man who had once signed my dismissal without hesitation, now belonged to me. I opened the shutters, let in the light, walked across the floor, taking in every detail with my eyes, and sat down in his former chair. It was too soft, worn out from years of permissiveness and arrogance. I put my hands on the armrests and closed my eyes. For a long time, there was no triumph or malice in it, just a quiet feeling that justice had caught up with its destiny. I opened my laptop, checked my email, and scheduled the first meeting. From that day on, everything was going to change, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible, unimportant, or unnecessary. He was still listed in the system. He had a few days of work left. I deliberately didn't fire him right away, because I wanted him to realize everything slowly, step by step. I wanted him to see how the company breathed without him, how employees smiled without fear, how his former subordinates were now growing, managing, making decisions. I knew he came to the office early to avoid running into me. But one morning I arrived earlier than usual. He was standing at the coffee machine and didn't even notice me at first. When he did, he turned pale. His expression said it all: confusion, awkwardness, shame, and maybe a hint of regret. "Good morning," I said simply, and walked past him. He didn't answer. I wasn't going to take revenge. I didn't need it. I had already won. But there were things I wanted to say to him face to face, not as a former subordinate, but as a person who had been forced to get back on her feet. That day, I invited him into my office. He sat down across from me, no longer as confident as he once was. "I'm firing you, John," I said calmly. "Not because I want revenge, but because this company no longer needs you. There's no place here for people who don't value others." He was silent. "You can leave a review," I added. "I'll keep it on file, so others can learn from your mistakes." He nodded. He stood up, and he left. And I remained, in my chair, in silence, in the company I had built with my own hands, with pride, with experience, with self-respect. And that was just the beginning. I returned home late in the evening. My fingers were tired from the paper and the keyboard, but my heart was calm. I had a job again. I had strength again. I was myself again. Only now I was different, more focused, more mature, but not broken. Young employees were already on duty outside my new office, listening intently to my advice and hanging on my every word. Once upon a time, I was in their shoes, scared, confused, hoping that someone would see my potential. Back then, no one did. Now I have discovered it in myself. But the shadow of the past still lingered. I felt it in messages from former colleagues, in rare calls from my former boss, in short screenshots sent to me with his pathetic attempts to latch onto some new company. He tried to cling to any opportunity, but as it turned out, no one wanted anything to do with him. The reputation of a person who humiliates employees burns the ground behind them, especially when the truth comes out.
I didn't seek revenge. I just moved forward, calmly, firmly, without making a fuss. But then one day I received a letter. He wrote it in obvious desperation, complaining about his circumstances, asking for human help, offering to forget everything. That was the moment that finally turned everything around for me. I remembered sitting in his office, how he looked at me with cold arrogance and said, "You are no longer suitable for our level." How he didn't even let me finish the interview, didn't listen, didn't offer an alternative, he just crossed me off. Now he wanted me to hear him, but you know what I did? I closed the letter. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to hurt him, it was because I understood that I was no longer the woman who once needed his approval. I gathered my hair, adjusted my jacket, and looked at my reflection in the glass. There was no longer any fear or dependence on other people's opinions in that face, only dignity and a slight fatigue that comes after a long journey. Tomorrow, I have a meeting with investors. The day after tomorrow, I have a meeting with a charity fund. And today, I have an evening of peace and quiet. I made myself some tea, sat down on the sofa, covered myself with a blanket, and allowed myself, for the first time in a long time, to simply relax. I was no longer chasing anything. I had already gotten everything back. Exactly 1 year has passed since that morning when I hurriedly gathered my things, kicked out of my own home. I stood at the door, confused, stunned by his words. "It's your own fault. I'm tired of supporting a useless woman." Back then, I felt empty, tired, old, and unwanted. Now I was standing on the steps of my own building. In my hands were the keys to the company I had built, and in my heart was gratitude to myself for not giving up. I sighed. The evening was warm, and the city was bustling somewhere in the distance. I walked to my car and got behind the wheel. I was no longer hiding from reality. I wasn't afraid of the future. I was alive. And then I saw him. He was sitting on a bench. His back was hunched. His hands were shaking. His face was unkempt. His shirt was stained. His eyes were empty. Our eyes met. He recognized me. I didn't look away. I looked straight at him, and for the first time in a long time I felt no pain. I felt no anger, no desire for revenge. I felt only freedom, complete, real. He stood up. He wanted to say something, but I shook my head gently. "I forgive you," I said, without raising my voice. "But you can't come back." I got in the car and drove away. No celebration, no big words. I just drove home, to the house I bought myself with money I earned honestly, through my hard work, my pain, and my perseverance. Now he was left there, on the bench, with the past he had chosen for himself. And I drove on, no hard feelings, no regrets, and with a warm glow of hope inside me. Because sometimes justice doesn't require shouting. It comes quietly, and it stays forever. I didn't expect to ever find myself back in his house, but this time it was different. It wasn't his house, it was my house, bought with the very money I had scrupulously saved for years before he took everything away from me. I stood in the spacious living room, where an old mirror still hung on the wall, the only thing left here from those days. But now its reflection no longer hurt me. It reminded me of who I was and who I had become. He tried to come back. He wrote, called from other people's phones, even sent letters, as if we were living in the past again. But every word he said sounded like empty noise, like the background hum of memories that should have been erased long ago. I never responded. My neighbors now addressed me by name. I was no longer just the woman who was abandoned. I was a woman who had returned, persevered, and rebuilt her life. People came to me for advice and words of support, and I gave it to them. Not because I wanted praise, but because I knew how important it is to have someone who believes in you when the whole world has given up on you. I started speaking at the local library, telling my story not as a tragedy, but as a journey. People listened, some with tears in their eyes. I saw in their eyes what had once burned in mine: hope. People wrote me letters, thanking me for the inspiration, and I realized that my pain had not been in vain. And him? He now lived in a shelter outside the city, according to my neighbor, always wearing the same worn-out jacket with a blank stare and eternal complaints about the injustice of life. But I was no longer afraid of him. I didn't feel sorry for him. I wasn't angry. I just forgot him. Like you forget a bad dream that didn't ruin your morning. My life was starting over, and now it's only with people who really deserve to be around me. I sat on the porch of my new home. The sun slowly sank below the horizon, painting the sky in soft golden hues. I held a cup of hot tea in my hands, and my mind was free of worries and doubts, only silence. Warm, calm, real. A year had passed. Just one, but it felt like a lifetime. I remembered the woman I was back then, broken, confused, thrown out of my own life, and now I was completely different. I had learned to choose myself, not to prove myself, not to beg, not to ask, just to be myself. My children came to visit me. Those who didn't know how to support me before were now by my side. We laughed, grilled corn, and reminisced about the past. I didn't tell them everything, only what they needed to know. My story wasn't about revenge. It was about the strength that comes from being alone and still getting back up. I went back to the gym. I joined a book club. Sometimes I held workshops for women who were going through similar experiences. We would get together, share our stories, and each of us regained not only our voice, but also our belief that life is not a sentence, but a chance. And him, he's in the past, forever. Sometimes I saw his name in the local charity news, a recipient of aid, in need, forgotten by everyone. I felt nothing, no anger, no pity, just emptiness, as if that chapter had never existed. But it did, and it made me who I am. Life isn't always fair. Sometimes it throws everything you don't deserve at you. But if you stand up, straighten your back, and take the first step, it will start to respond in kind. Not right away, not easily, but it will. I lifted my head and smiled. The future was waiting for me, not with screams, not with pain, not with despair, but with silence, light, and freedom. I am no longer a victim. I am a winner.